All right, thanks. So what's all this about? Let me just dive into this and maybe we'll figure it out here. Basically, here's my agenda for this talk. A little bit of background and context about what this is about, what this perfect storm thing is about, what the three pieces of the puzzle are, a few considerations, and maybe some discussion. So I've been, as many of you know, this is like continuing my controversial talks at NANOG, but as many of you know, I've been spending a lot of time studying complexity and what it meant for networks and our designs and all of that stuff. We did this panel, I don't know, NANOG 26, it's in the distant past now, and we did RSC 3439. And I was, in my work at Cisco, I was looking at things like NGN and IMS, and I did a talk about that too at NANOG 33, I guess, because when I saw it, I went, whoa, what is this thing? And so as you might imagine, let's see, oh, this didn't work too well. I exported these slides from Keynote. So anyway, I started wondering where all this stuff was going and what it meant for, the internet at large and more directly for operational considerations, how things like IMS or NGN would interact with the architecture and what the implications of these what I'm calling policy-based networks. And what I mean by that is really basically these high-touch access networks. And here's the key thing. I was wondering about, what are the implications of trying to tie perceived high-margin application revenue directly to the packet transport, which is what these things are trying to do. So I'm just wondering about that. And the question really becomes, can you really do that with the internet architecture? And a lot of people are trying, but you want to know what happens if you try, and here's the hint. Things get complicated. But, so I'm thinking about this, but we'll see in a second. Sorry about the slides again. We'll see in a second why this becomes interesting. But as you might imagine, those of you who know me, I was pretty skeptical of all of this stuff. And in analyzing this space a bit, I proposed this scenario, and it's a simple scenario you'll see in a second, but somehow you name it and you own it. And I said, hey, there's sort of a perfect storm out there, and all of a sudden I owned it. So I'm sure there's a better name for this, but that's how this came to be. And the rest of this talk is just going to review that. So what exactly is this? Well, it's some crummy slides. It's a bunch of it's a few observations, three basic events that could really lead to a restructuring of the industry, or lead to, or is causing, depending on how you see it. So basically, there are these three things. Low margin yet profitable IP packet carriage businesses either emerge or already exist. This is what all of this NGN stuff was trying to say. Hey, we got to put all this, high touch stuff into our core networks because we need that to be profitable. What I'm suggesting, we'll see what this means in a second, but this is sort of the idea that, oh, well, maybe you could be profitable even if margins were slim. The second piece of this is access monopolies get weakened or cease to exist. You will see in a second, that's pretty controversial as well. And the third piece was something you can't read, I guess, but basically a set of peer-to-peer applications emerge that basically co-opt these big revenue streams that while they are themselves diminishing a bit, they're still out there. So it's a set of observations, right? These three observations about the trajectory and state of the current internet. And it involves economics, public policy, technology, and importantly, the internet architecture. That's why we're all here. And it's based on, it's based on the end-to-end principle when it's all said and done. And, we can argue about like everyone else about what the end-to-end principle really says. And I think, yeah, see that reference. That's kind of the canonical reference, I think, on end-to-end. But here's the key feature. Well, the key feature is not that it overwrote the title, but the key feature is that if you do IP packet carriage in the core of your network, it's going to be a commodity business, and we'll see why. If you want the intuition on it, it's just that in the end-to-end principle puts the value on the edges of the network, not in the core. And I'll note that this conclusion may be considered controversial by some or many. And it also doesn't mean that there isn't margin in say, carrying 2547 or something like that. Obviously there is, but that's just such a tiny part of the traffic mix that's out there today. And so let's look at this in just a little more detail. So what do I mean by this emergence of low margin yet profitable packet carriage? The hypothesis here is that a direct consequence of the end-to-end principle is that it's a commodity, right? Packet carriage is a commodity. And, you know, you can say it differently. IP architecture dictates that the higher margin value proposition is on the edge. So, you know, you can conclude sort of, if you believe this, that if you're in the packet transport biz, i.e., you know, you're transporting bulk or wholesale IP or whatever you want to call it, you're probably going to wind up having to make your living in a kind of a low margin environment. And here's where this all came from in my own thinking is that you can really contrast this with the activity around, say, all of this high up margin packet transport, NGN, IMS, AIMS. You know, why do we need AIMS? We don't even have IMS yet. But anyway, and not surprisingly, there's all kinds of disagreement on this point, especially in the case of IP people and telco people discussing this. But what's the relationship between commodity businesses and margin structures, you ask? I had to go learn this because I didn't understand all of this stuff. I don't feel I'm quite an expert on it, but I'm getting better. But basically, the classic commodity businesses are capitalized by these significant capital expenditures in their plants and low profit margins and a bunch of competition. Well, I mean, that kind of sounds familiar, right? We've seen that. And, you know, in all of these cases, if you want to kind of analyze this, you have to also look at whether or not you can get if you can get capital, because if not, then upfront requirements will form a barrier to entry. You know, like in the cases, not everybody's putting down submarine cables or whatever, and that'll reduce or eliminate competition, which some people think is a good thing. And you also have to watch out for this natural monopolies thing. Can't read this, but basically, in some cases, especially in the case of incumbent access providers, adding capacity to their networks could be significantly lower than what it costs a new entrant, and that can cause incumbents to squeeze out competition too. Another property is that of classic commodities is frequently cited is that they have this property that the incremental cost of providing the good or service that you're trying to provide approaches zero, or the marginal cost does. And, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the incremental cost of forwarding a packet in your core network? Well, it's kind of like zero, right? So it's the lack of differentiation in the core, you know, QoS, anyone? I don't think so. And the intense competition out there has driven us all to low margins, which over time, with reduced plant costs, has driven incremental costs down. So we're seeing classic commodity behavior here. That's the point here. So it's a classic commodity. Well, you could kind of deduce that from the end-to-end principle already, right? I mean, it's just that it'd be nice to have some economic foundation behind that. So we also know that margins are going to naturally be pretty thin. So the conclusion here, and this is sort of the antithesis of the conclusion of the NGN work, but the conclusion here is that SPs need to be profitable in a commodity or low margin environment if we're going to have a viable and vibrant business environment. And the important point here is that the high margin proposition isn't in the packet transport. So what this is really all about, I mean, at the end of the day, what it's really all about is we have the internet technology, the architecture, it's got end-to-end principle in it, that's what made it so powerful. And then what we want to be doing now is looking at the sort of the convolution of all of that technology with the economics of packet transport itself. And this is kind of the key here. We want to simultaneously preserve the end-to-end nature of the internet, because that's where all the goodness has come from, and have viable economics at the same time. Normally what people say to me is, what, you don't want my company to be profitable? Of course we want everybody to be profitable. That's not the deal. So low margin but profitable IP packet carriage. This is my kind of aside on this, in case you're wondering. The economics of all of this is about as clear as and about as well understood as the network complexity issues. So we need to, you can't see the bottom of this, but I think one of the things we need to do here is encourage multidisciplinary research in this area so that we can get some, I would call it cross-pollination among the various disciplines that are involved here. Okay, so this is the second thing. So we have this thing, okay, somebody becomes profitable in a low margin environment, they learn how to do it, we all learn how to do it. Second thing, access monopolies. Well, you know, there are new technologies out there, say WiMAX. I don't know WiMAX is the one, but you know, just something. I just wrote down one that's out there. Or just plain competition, and the access will help. And then there's things like 700 megahertz and what's going on with EU-wide and UMTS and things like that. So there's a little truth in advertising here. Some folks have posited that the competition in the access is really effectively impossible because it's capital intensive and it's a natural monopoly, is like we said on the other page. That's what some people are saying. The other one is, you're not going to be able to say this, but basically there's no technology, wireless or no wireless or non-traditional access technology that we have right now that's inexpensive, say wireless, that allows, say, get 10 or 100 HD channels to your handset or wherever you want to take it. So those are technology challenges that are out there. But why is this important? Well, competition makes it much harder or impossible to profitably field these policy-based networks. Remember, I'm calling these policy-based networks are these high-touch edge networks. But why is this true? Well, first off, you've got to consider the cost of building and running one of these things, and given its complexity, they're very complex, and given that complexity, its reliability. So, all that cost has to go somewhere. It goes to the consumer. And, there's no way that any SP, as good as they are going to be able to innovate at the same rate as the entire Internet does. That's the whole power of the thing, right? End-to-end principle, again, surprisingly. And you have to look at the success of something like AOL or other attempted, they're walled garden providers. So this is just an editorial comment saying, then why are we trying to do IMS? There's a reason for that too, or things like it. So, gosh, that's not too good. What are the implications of all of this? This is the real controversial statement I have in here, is that these policy-based networks, and now I'm talking about, suppose you field IMS or something like it, where the idea is just explicitly to tie application revenue to the packet transport and the access network. These things are really costly to build and operate. They're less reliable, and this is the irony. They're less service rich. Well, why do they cost more? Complexity. Why are they less reliable? Complexity. Why are they less service risk? Well, stay tuned. Well, these slides really didn't transfer very well. So again, this is about, now you have internet technology, you have access technology, and you have public policy, because the access is where all of this public policy activity is happening. So it's kind of like net neutrality plus or something. And of course, the access networks also must be profitable under some models. So there's also, this is also about, how do we produce viable business models that for access providers that preserve the properties that we want. Okay, and of course there are a lot of people who think that access network infrastructure or even long-haul infrastructure should be some sort of public good, such as the roads or whatever. So the most basic question in all of this, to me anyway, is, given all of that, how do we handle the next wave of access bandwidth requirements? Say, if you had IP HDTV or something. And how will future upgrades to those plants be funded? And which technologies? So suffice it to say, here's the point, is that there's a lot of, there are many real technology, business model, and public policy issues in here. And I think all of those need more study and more multidisciplinary work. So here's my earlier question, why are these less service rich? Well, gosh, this is too bad. So suppose you're a walled garden policy-based SP. So history is the guide here, right? So innovation on the edge will force you, the walled garden provider, to let new services through. Why? Well, because your customers will demand it. Because why? Because and the end principle is giving us this innovation on the edge. So the canonical case for that is, port 80 and 443. And this is part of the reason why the existence of competition in the access is so important. Because if we don't have that, then you don't have any choice as a consumer. And of course, once you let any port through, everything can be tunneled, and that's a great aspect of the internet architecture. It gives us it's democratizing, right? And here's some examples, Skypes or anything else that's over the top. So why are they less service rich still? Gosh, well, sorry. Basically, you can't do anything about it. You can't do anything about it in the access network case, because what people have tried to do is they try to field these policy-based networks that stop you from doing anything that's not your service. And Typically, it's done with a DPI engine, some kind of deep packet inspection technology. But you can't really use that, because the reason why is because you might be able to find the signature of something like encrypted voice today, right? But basically, you have to block everything that you can't identify. And so that means that everything that's over the top has to be treated by default logic, right? So either you have to allow nothing temporarily, because you can't do that forever because your customers will demand that you don't, or everything. And the conclusion is you can't really effectively stop over time. It's just not possible to do it if there's competition in the access. Of course, if there's no competition, then you're wedded to whoever your access provider is, and you don't have choices there. And you really do need something that's like roughly analogous to Carter phone. I don't know if people know what that is, but somebody was bold enough to build a phone that wasn't AT&T back in '68 or so and tried to bolt it to the network, and it took the Supreme Court to resolve the fact that you can put any device onto the network. I mean, you can't imagine today having your access provider tell you what kind of computer you can have, but that's what essentially is going on in the wireless world. So we don't really have Carter phone for wireless yet. What's next? Okay, now this is the third piece of the puzzle, and this is pretty obvious. Applications emerge that target, revenue streams of the incumbents, right? So they capture revenue streams. Okay, so end-to-end principle again, because you can do this on the end-to-end. You can do this end-to-end. And the key here is this decentralized control. Nobody owns the control of, say, some peer-to-peer network. And voice was the first one. It was easy. It was large. It was relatively easily co-opted by someone like Skype or whoever, Vonage, what's left of it, et cetera. But it goes on to video, FMC, presence, all of this stuff. And so the only current strategy I see against this is bundling. Service bundling is the hedge that people are using, but I don't see how that can hold up either, because there's a business in just providing those bundles. And so this is about, okay, now we have the internet technology again, and in nature and all of that stuff, and traditional carrier architectures and business models that are clashing here. And the particular thing I think that's going on here is that while traditional carrier networks were very vertically integrated, the network was the application, the internet's horizontally integrated, right? And so that has the effect of making what used to be a service that you sold on your network into an application, and voice is just the one you want to talk about. So what happens? Okay, so now somebody or some set of providers are profitable in low margin environments, so the end-to-end nature of the network's preserved there in the long haul transport. There's weakened or access, none or weakened access monopolies, so competition for that. And there's a large scale co-opting of traditional carrier service provider revenue streams by peer-to-peer applications or whatever else is out there. So will our industry restructure under such a scenario, and how? That's the question of all of it. That's the end game question of all of this. And we know this stuff happens, and it happens rapidly, right? Given the technology that we've built and deployed. And the example I like to use is the recording industry, because this is the thing that when I think about this is that I really doubt that anybody in at RCA or Sony Records was sitting around going, it's like, oh, peer-to-peer networking, that'll probably cause my entire industry to restructure. I guarantee you nobody was thinking that, but it certainly has. And it happened pretty rapidly. So the question people always ask me when I'm talking about this is, how much of this is already out there? And is it really kind of an if this happens? So interesting, this isn't a kind of an aside, but when I was making these slides, I was listening to CNBC, and Kramer was talking about, well, how do you detect when the market bottom is really occurring? And what he said was, you have to watch the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and he said some things about where things occur on the Wall Street Journal as signals. Well, I thought, okay, so I get to my office, and I had a copy of Telecommunications in my mailbox, right? And so I went back and I looked at this, and this is June 2006. So kind of a year ago, right? IMS, stuff like that. This is what was in my mailbox. It's like you look at that and I go, now maybe it's the same thing. It's like people are starting to see what's really happening out here. So I found that kind of interesting. But there's a catch to all this too, as always, right? And all of this breaks down when capacity, when we're out of capacity, whatever dimension of the capacity is, because then you have to upgrade plants. And so if you maxed out your fiber, your fib, whatever it is, at that point there can be nonlinear costs. And this is why we need, okay, this is what I'm talking about, fiber bills, forklift upgrades, whatever they are. So we need economic models that both preserve the IP architecture and provide sufficient ROI to sustain the industry. And what's interesting is that this whole idea that we need to meld our operational technology and some more theoretical work together seems to be taking off in a lot of different areas. Like I heard Ray mention that there'll be some talk about IP markets. That's the thing that economists really need to look at and help us with. In case you think the bandwidth, some people think, well, bandwidth, there's always this whole thing about, the amount of bandwidth the internet uses is doubling every week or every month. I looked at, have you guys seen this, the Mint's homepage? It's pretty interesting, but, if you look at this, there's, it's growing at, if it's growing at 50% per year, that's pretty significant. Okay, so that's all good. That's a nice view of it. That's that's all goodness, is stating the obvious, but what's an ISP supposed to do about it? Well, this is also a crummy slide apparently, but you're supposed to, one thing you can do is you can really be realistic about the OpEx complexity trade-offs. I think that was one of the things that wasn't being done during all the years that people were doing convergence. They just were not being realistic. Oh, yeah, so I heard Vijay say this, he said, the best thing you can do is be rational. And obviously we need better tools here because we just have little or no analytical capability in this space. And while we're thinking about this, we really need to keep in mind that, governments can intervene or regulators can intervene, and that's a trump card. So you as operators, from my perspective, should work with vendors, standards organizations, open source community to build the platforms and protocols that have these kind of needed properties that will let us get there. So what should vendors be doing? Well, listening to SPs when you guys tell us this stuff, first off, that doesn't always happen. But this problem is kind of thorny because vendors, like everyone, want to maintain margins. They have to. My hypothesis here is that even if all this materializes, if it hasn't already, vendors will be able to preserve some advantageous margins for some customers. I mean, they will. But if what evolves is sort of the need for sort of low margin from the vendor perspective interfaces because there's so much demand on bandwidth capacity, so then they may need a hedge strategy against their margin strategies. And the obvious one is simplify things. We've been talking about that for a while. And writing the Ethernet cost performance curve. Ethernet performance up, cost down. And this leads to another thought. It's like one of the things that people have always talked about is, from the vendor perspective, is investment protection. If another way to think about this is maybe you have a disposable network, right? Maybe since interfaces are starting all to go to Ethernet, and since we're talking about sort of commoditized service at least in the core network, maybe what you want to do is you want to ride this curve and build things that are cheap enough to swap out on some regular schedule instead of upgrading. That's just another way to think about what could be done. So where to from here? Well, I wish I had better slides, sorry. All of this is, from my perspective again, it's just a scenario where, the internet that we know and love, it just continues to grow and thrive. And this is it's pretty deep contrast with the value-added transport proposition that was NGN, that's IMS and all of those things. And I think people need to note that everything is over the top on the internet, even though people sometimes like to make fine distinctions. They're not. And we need to get better understanding of all of this in a multidisciplinary way of evolving needs. What's the effect of bandwidth drivers like video and so forth? How about having access speeds approach the speeds that we have in the core networks? That's a big one. Or 2 megs to the handset, or TDM to packet. That's a sore one with me, but things like that. So then, this is the other question people always ask me: is it really that it's already happened? It's all over. There's a few opinions on that. don't know if you know Eric Cecil. He's a frequent poster on this. I think he's at L3, I think. But this is the statement he gave me, or he wrote on that list. And the value he was talking about being wiped out was the perceived high margin packet revenue. And then this Fred Goldstein wrote about it in a book called A Great Telecom Meltdown, but basically said that the confluence of all of these three things synergized in such a way that has caused this perfect storm thing. So a few final thoughts. We need to educate ourselves and our community more about what the internet is. People really don't. It's shocking to me sometimes how much people don't really understand what it is. And the community here includes SPs, enterprise operators, content providers, researchers, vendors, users of all kinds, regulators, that's really important, so forth. We need to encourage, and encourage means fund, however we do it as a community, multidisciplinary research in this area. And, I don't know how many folks have looked at these various issues, but basically theory, data, and practice are all very slim out there. Finally, so here's the bad outcome of all of this. And actually, I have to attribute this to Dave Clark because he wrote this in an email to me when he was looking at this stuff. Service providers can't be profitable enough to continue bandwidth upgrades. This is the bad outcome if it happens. Service providers then attempt to choke off innovation for perceived self-preservation, of course, and they do it via legislative or regulatory means or technical means, IMS, whatever. And we all want to avoid that outcome because that just destroys the internet as we know it, and nobody wants that. So we want all of the aspects of the sort of economic and technical ecosystem to work together. That's that. How to do for time. Good. Bill.
Dave, thanks a lot for that talk. These are issues I've been thinking about a lot also. And one of the data points I got from the field was that most Americans think they have enough bandwidth from the broadband connection.
No. Have you talked to my daughter?
Well, let me put it to you. What do you think is the bandwidth that you'd like to see us have to the household in the next couple of years?
100 megs, symmetrical. Just like, why not? Why not? Like in Tokyo or whatever.
I think in your presentation, though, you pointed out
for $40 a month.
For $40 a month. Hey, that's probably $40 US too, and that's a good deal.
So the last question, though, is you mentioned that there are a variety of technical and business and political and so forth issues, and that seems to be where the greatest quagmire potentially lays between you and your 100 megs to the home. Where do you think these issues are most effectively going to be discussed?
That's a really good question. The reason I framed this thing up like this is because it's just a deeply multidisciplinary problem. And I'm not sure that any venue that I've seen so far is the one that's going to bring the right people together to solve these problems, which are deep because they're problems, they're technology problems, they're industry problems, So I don't have a good answer for that. But what I'm really hoping is that over the next couple of years we can put together some forums that we can actually discuss these issues are. And like if you look out here, we all understand the technology aspects of it, but there are very few of us who understand, who are economists, and Jeff is a little bit maybe, or there's some people who are, but that's what we need. So we have to build that, I think. Jeff?
Jeff Houston, do you want to just go back a slide? Your bad outcome slide. We're actually there. You're right there. You're already at the bad outcome. What actually happens when someone attacks you and you are the massive incumbent? Because over the last 100 years, we built massive telephone companies, largest industry sector on the planet and the richest, massively overbuilt, employed hundreds of thousands of people. Then this upstart industry started eating the margin. Try and squash it. Didn't work. Buy it. Integrate it. Swallow it. And then you protect your position. Start playing around by making the barrier to entry high again. Start playing the regulatory card. Who owns most of the broadband mass deployment? Struggling independent ISPs or telco money? What actually happened over the last few years was a massive reconsolidation of this industry. You're now in about the worst place you can possibly be. And realistically, you're there. You're there because we've now eaten through most of the margins of oversupply that we built in the last 20 years. And you're now facing a massive capital investment bill of no way of paying it. And you've gutted the industry. The margins aren't the same way anymore. So what's going to happen? Obviously, you can't turn it off. And obviously, people want their profits and their margins. Obviously, the regulatory card is going to be played by the incumbents. And we're just going to have to live with it. So now comes the issue of which way do you want it played? And if you want a network that works, maybe we should resist the NGNs and the IMSs of this world and keep on trying to say there is a way that we can all enjoy this game, or you can give up. But, you know, right now you're at a very bad place, and it's not going to get any better at this particular point, because most of those cards about the independent ISP versus telco got played and lost. They just had too much money. And now you're in this next state of you're at the bad outcome point.
That's exactly why I'm talking about this. Because, you know, I don't think we want this, you know, I mean, as a community. Well, as an SP community.
You're there. It's not a case of wanting it or not wanting it. You know, this is 2007. And this is precisely the state you're at.
Okay. I mean, I'm not arguing that point. I'm just saying my thesis here is that we can find a way. I'm not saying I know what it is, because if I did, I'd be in a different state. But I mean, I do think we can find a way to preserve those properties that I was describing while finding ways for people to be profitable. We just haven't done it yet. And I don't think, personally, as far as, again, I'm not an economist, don't play one on TV, all that kind of stuff, but in my understanding of what's out there, that is a primitive discipline as well with respect to the network. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and maybe we can make some progress. Joel.
Joel Yegley, Nokia. Just to respond to Jeff, yes, we are there right now, and the incumbent carriers, particularly in the cellular industry, love this IMS stuff. The problem they have is even they can't afford it. So, I mean, their build out of new technologies that are supposed to preserve their margin is going to run up against their ability to finance even that at this point. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'll put up some better formatted slides for people, so if they want to get them, they can get the PDF or something. Thank you.